The notice is taped to the steel of her oxygen tank, low on the green cylinder where the regulator hisses, and the woman in the chair will not look at it. She keeps her hands folded. The tube under her nose draws and releases, draws and releases. The only sound in the room until the dog at the door stops breathing. He goes still first. Wade had learned to read that stillness the way other men read a clock. The German shepherd at his knee had lifted his head from a half-doze, ears swinging forward, dark eyes fixed on the paper stuck to the tank, like it was something alive. Then the dog took one slow step into the apartment without being asked, and Wade followed, and the cold March light coming through the mill window fell across an eviction notice. Somebody had pressed flat against a sick woman's lifeline. He read it twice. He felt the heat come up the back of his neck, the way it used to come before a thing went wrong overseas, and he made himself breathe it down. Then he reached out and peeled the notice off the tank, slow, so the tape would not pull the regulator loose, and he folded it once and held it. If a story ever leaves a mark on you, this is one to stay with. Watch it through to the end, and you will understand why 3 phone calls mattered more than any door he ever kicked. 3 weeks before that morning, Wade Marsh did not know Fay Holloway existed, and he wanted it that way. He had been out of the Corps 4 months, 22 years in the last 6, as a gunnery sergeant, and then a knee that finally said no, and a medical retirement and a truck packed with everything he owned. He had driven north until the roads got narrow and the cell signal got thin, and he had stopped in a Vermont mill town called Cobb's Reach because the rent on a back room over a hardware store was cheap and nobody there knew his name. He had told himself he would keep moving. He told himself that the way a man tells himself he will quit smoking. The dog knew better. Bram had served with him 2 tours, a working-line shepherd with a tan and black saddle coat, and one ear that carried a small notch from a wire fence in another country, and Bram had stopped trusting the word soon a long time ago. The dog wanted a porch. The dog wanted a bowl that stayed in the same place. Wade pretended not to notice. He took work where he found it. He could fix a furnace, hang a door, run wire, patch a roof. The hardware store owner, a wide, quiet man named Sutter, who had buried 2 sons and said almost nothing, started passing Wade's number to people who called in needing hands. That was how Wade ended up at the old Pemberton textile mill on the river, a long brick building that some company had carved into apartments, hired to chase a draft in a 3rd-floor unit where an old woman could not keep warm. The mill sat where the water turned. 4 stories of dark brick with tall arched windows, most of them original glass that warped the light. Snow still lay in the shadowed corners of the yard, though it was nearly spring. Wade parked, let Bram out, and stood a moment looking up at it. Combat never bothered him the way certain quiet places did. A building like that held 100 years of people who had worked themselves down to nothing, and it hummed with it. Fay Holloway opened her door before he knocked. She was 76 and small, stooped, in a heavy gray cardigan buttoned to the throat, with thin white hair pinned back and pale blue eyes that had not given up yet. The oxygen tube ran from her nose down to a green tank on a little wheeled cart she kept beside her chair. She looked at the dog first, the way the good ones always did. "He bite?" she asked. "No, ma'am, he just watches. Good." "So do I." She stepped back to let them in. The unit was clean and cold and almost bare. A recliner with a knit blanket folded over the arm, a small television on a stand, a card table with a worn Bible and a deck of cards laid out for solitaire, a kitchen the size of a closet. On the windowsill sat 3 African violets in coffee cans leaning toward what little light came through. A framed photograph stood on the television, a man in work clothes, squinting in front of the same mill, younger than the building. The draft was easy to find. Somebody had replaced a cracked window pane years back with the wrong size glass and shimmed the gap with cardboard, and the cardboard had gone soft, and the river wind came straight through it. Wade ran his thumb along the soft edge of it and felt the cold pour over his hand, like water. He had it measured in 2 minutes and told her he would bring proper glass and glazing the next day and seal it for the cost of the materials. The materials, she repeated, like she was checking him for a trick. Not your time. My time's not worth much these days, he said. She did not believe that he could tell, but she let it stand, and the dog at her feet sighed and shifted, and the small, cold room settled around the 3 of them. She studied him. Sutter, send you, he did. Then I won't argue the price. She lowered herself back into the recliner, and the tank hissed, and Bram lay down on the cold floor with his chin on his paws and his eyes on her, and something in the old woman's face loosened a fraction. 40 years I taught 3rd grade in this county, she said, to no one in particular. Now I argue with a window. That answer stayed in Wade's head longer than he expected. He came back the next morning with the right glass cut to size, a tube of glazing compound, and a thermos of his own coffee, because hers, he had noticed, was instant and rationed. While he worked, she talked, the way people who live alone talk when a body finally sits in the room. Her husband, Harold, had been gone 11 years, a millwright himself who had run the looms in this very building before it closed, dead of the same lungs that were now coming for her. She had no children. A son had been born too early and lived 2 days a long time ago, and she said it plainly and did not invite comment, and Wade gave none, only kept his hands moving on the glass. She had the recliner, the cards, a sister 3 hours south, who called on Sundays, the 3 violets in their coffee cans, and a window that whistled. She had lived in the Pemberton Mill for 9 years, since the company first opened the apartments back when the management came to your door at Christmas with a tin of cookies, and the maintenance man knew everyone by name. His name was Petey, she said of the maintenance man. He retired the year before the new people bought it. They didn't replace him with a person, they replaced him with a phone number that puts you on hold. Wade scraped the old glazing free and set the new pane and pressed it home, and the river wind that had owned the corner of the room for years lost its way in. It's different now, she said. New people bought it. You don't see them. You get letters. Wade fit the new pane and ran the bead of glazing clean and even, and the whistling stopped, and the room went quiet in a way that seemed to surprise her. She put her hand flat against the warm glass like she was checking whether it was real. He should have left it there. A window was a window. He told himself he was only being thorough when he asked about the rest of the unit, the heat, the smoke detector, the lock. The smoke detector had a dead battery. The dead bolt was loose in the jamb. He fixed both, because it took 20 minutes, and because Bram had not moved from the floor beside her chair the whole time, and a man learns to trust what his dog decides to guard. That was the first day. He did not know yet about the letters in the drawer. A week passed. He took other jobs, a furnace in town that needed a thermocouple, a sagging gutter, heavy with the winter's last ice, a frozen pipe in the church basement where the pastor, a tired, gentle man named Ortiz, fed him coffee and asked no questions. Ortiz had been at the church 11 years and had buried a good number of the town's old, and he carried the patient sadness of a man who watched a place slowly empty. He never preached at Wade. He only filled the cup again and said, the second time Wade came, that the mill apartments had been good for the old folks once and were not good for them now, and let the sentence sit there unfinished, like a tool laid out for whoever might pick it up. Wade kept telling himself he was passing through. He kept driving back to the mill anyway, on small excuses. A hinge he wanted to check, a smoke detector he wanted to test again, because the cold March kept finding new ways through the old brick, and because the old woman had started setting out a second cup before he reached the top of the stairs. It was on one of those visits that he saw the envelope. It sat on her card table, unopened. The return address, a property management company, with a name that sounded like a law firm, Caldwell Asset Partners. Faye covered it with the deck of cards when she saw him notice. Junk, she said. It was not junk. Bram had crossed to the table and stood with his nose an inch from the envelope, tail low and still. And Wade had learned that the dog rarely fixed on paper without a reason behind it. He had come to weigh. That read heavier than anything a person told him. "Miss Holloway," he said, "how many of those have you gotten?" Her jaw worked. For a long moment she looked like the school teacher she had been, deciding whether the boy in the third row was worth the trouble of correcting. Then she pulled open the drawer of the card table and took out a rubber-banded stack of envelopes, 8 or 9 of them, and set them down without a word. He read them in order, while the tank hissed and the light failed in the windows. The first, 4 months back, was polite. A notice of new ownership, a welcome, a reminder that all leases were being reviewed for compliance. The second, a month later, was a request for documentation, a copy of her lease, proof of income, an updated emergency contact. The third raised her rent by $400. The fourth was the first to use the word concern. Concern about safety. Concern about a tenant living alone with a medical condition in a unit that the company now described as not suitable for assisted living. The fifth named her oxygen equipment as a fire hazard. The sixth gave her 30 days. It either provide a signed waiver releasing the company of all liability or vacate. The most recent, the one under the cards, gave her 15 and... "They want me gone," Faye said. "She said it the way you report weather. They've been wanting it since they bought the place. I'm in the corner unit on the 3rd floor, with the river view and the big windows." A man came around in the fall with a clipboard and measured everything and never said a word to me. I'm not the only one. There's 6 of us still here from the old days. The rest took the money or got scared off. Wade sat with the letters in his lap. The pressure in his chest tightened in a way he did not have a clean name for. He had spent 22 years learning that a threat with paperwork behind it was more dangerous than a threat with a rifle, because the paperwork was patient, and it never slept, and it wore a tie. "The oxygen isn't a fire hazard," he said. "Of course it isn't. It's medical equipment. The fire department inspected it themselves 2 years ago and gave me a card to put on the door so they'd know it was there in an emergency." She gestured at the door, where a small laminated card hung from a thumbtack. "But the company says it's dangerous. They've got a report." "What report? I never saw it." "They just say it. Outside, the river ran high and gray with snowmelt. Inside, an old woman folded her hands over a stack of letters that were trying to take her home, and a Marine, who had come north to disappear, understood that he was not going anywhere for a while. Bram had put his head in Faye's lap. She rested one thin hand on his skull, and the dog let her, and Wade watched the two of them and felt the floor of his good intentions give way. The next morning he came early before she was up, to seal the last drafty corner of the unit and to be there when the 8 o'clock changed nothing and 9 o'clock came. He let himself into the building with the key Sutter had cut and climbed to the 3rd floor. And Bram went up the stairs ahead of him 2 at a time, and at the top the dog stopped at Faye's door and went rigid. Wade came up behind him and saw it. The eviction notice, the formal one, the final one, taped flat to the green steel of her oxygen tank just inside the cracked open door. Faye sat in her recliner with her hands folded, not looking at it, the tube under her nose drawing and releasing, and the dog stood between her and the paper as though the paper were a man. Someone had been inside her home. Someone had come in past a 76-year-old woman on oxygen and taped a legal threat to the one machine keeping her breathing, where she would have to look at it every hour of every day. Wade peeled it off the tank, slow, careful of the regulator, and folded it once, and held it, and made himself breathe down the heat at the back of his neck. Then he crouched beside her chair so his eyes were level with hers. "Who came in?" he asked. "The manager. Pruitt. He has a key. He says he gave notice. He didn't." Her voice did not shake, but her hand did, where it lay on Bram's neck. "He said the date on that paper is the date I'm out. He said if I'm not, the sheriff puts me out. He said it like he was reading a weather report, same as me." Wade looked at the folded notice in his hand. He thought about the way a younger version of himself would have driven straight to the management office and put a man named Pruitt against a wall. That man would have felt good for about 10 minutes, and then handed the company exactly the story it wanted: the unstable veteran, the threat, the reason to call the law on the wrong person. He did not do that. Years of discipline had trained him to wait one breath before acting, but years of watching paper crush quiet people had trained him to act all the same. He took out his phone. "I'm going to make 3 calls," he told her. "I want you to hear all of them so you know exactly what's happening in your own house. Is that all right?" She looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded. Once, the way a teacher nods at a right answer. The first call he made was to a number Pastor Ortiz had given him the week before, without Wade asking why he might want it. A legal aid office 2 counties over that did nothing but elder housing. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, brisk and unhurried at the same time. Her name was Dana Okafor, and she had been an attorney for 19 years, and she had heard the words taped to her oxygen tank before he finished the sentence and went very quiet. "Don't let her sign anything," Okafor said. "Don't let her leave. Don't let them tell her the date is final. A notice is not an order. Only a judge can order an eviction in this state, and only after a hearing she has the right to attend. Do you have the lease?" She has it. Photograph every page. Photograph every letter they've sent. Photograph the notice on the tank before you throw it out, and the tape, and where it was. Photograph the fire department's medical equipment card on her door. I'll be there this afternoon. A pause. "Sergeant, the fact that they put it on the oxygen tank tells you they're not careful people. Careless people leave a trail. We're going to follow it." That hit him harder than he expected, the steadiness in her voice. He hung up and did exactly as she said, and Faye watched him photograph her whole sad correspondence with a kind of grim relief, like a patient finally being believed about the pain. The second call he made was to the Cobb's Reach Fire Department, to the non-emergency line, and he asked for whoever had inspected the medical equipment registry. The dispatcher put him through to a deputy fire marshal named Hollis Greer, a man with a slow mountain voice who remembered Faye Holloway's unit because he had inspected it himself. "Personally signed off on that setup," Greer said. "Tanks secured, regulators good. She's got the card on the door, so my people know it's there if we ever roll up. There is nothing about that equipment that violates any code I enforce. Who's telling you it's a hazard? The company that owns the building. Caldwell Asset Partners. They say they have a report. The line went quiet. I'd surely like to see that report, Greer said, and there was something cold in the slow voice now. Because I'm the only authority in this town who can write one on that equipment, and I didn't write it. You tell that lawyer to get me a copy of whatever they're waving around. If somebody put my office's name on a document I never signed, that's not a tenant problem anymore. That's mine. The third call was the hardest, because it was the one that turned a private fight into a public one, and Wade was a man who had spent 4 months trying to be no one. He called the number on a flyer Faye kept on her refrigerator. A tenants association somebody had tried to start in the building 2 years back and let die. The woman who answered was named Loretta Sims, 68, a retired postal clerk who lived 2 floors down and had been waiting, it turned out, for one single person to make the first call. I've got the others' numbers, Loretta said, fast and bright with relief. The Pearsons on too, both in their 80s, married 60 years, and they're scared to death. Old Mr. Barr. Vasquez on one, he's deaf as a post, but sharp as a tack. And he writes everything down, every letter, every visit, dates and times, in a little spiral notebook he keeps by his chair. And there's Dottie Mercer, on 3 down the hall. From Faye and me, 6 of us they've been working on. We just none of us knew the others were getting the same letters. They told each one of us we were the only problem. They told me my unit had a complaint against it for noise, and I haven't raised my voice since I retired from the post office. They told the Pearsons their lease was never properly renewed. They told Mr. Carr. Vasquez, his rent assistance, had lapsed when it hadn't, each one a different lie, fit to a different person, so we'd each go quiet in our own way. Wade listened to that and turned it over. The careful cruelty of it, a separate lie cut to measure for each frightened tenant the way a tailor cuts a coat. It was not the work of a careless man. It was the work of someone who had done it in other buildings, in other towns, and learned exactly how to keep 6 people from ever comparing notes. That was the lever. Wade felt it the moment she said it. The company had survived this long by keeping the old tenants apart, each one alone with the same fear, each one believing the trouble was theirs alone. 6 frightened people in 6 separate rooms were 6 evictions. 6 frightened people in one room were a problem with a name. By that afternoon, Faye's small, cold apartment held more living souls than it had in years. Dana Okafor arrived in a battered station wagon with a banker's box and reading glasses pushed up in her gray-streaked hair, and she spread Faye's letters across the card table and read them in order the way Wade had, and her face hardened line by line. Loretta brought the Pearsons, who held hands the entire time and finished each other's sentences, and a thermos of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Dottie Mercer came from down the hall, a small, sharp woman with a walker and a memory like a ledger, and she brought her own letters in a grocery bag. Mr. got her own letters in grocery bag. Vasquez came up slow on Wade's arm with a spiral notebook held to his chest like scripture. Pastor Ortiz came because Loretta called him, and because he had been waiting too, and he stood by the door with his hands folded and said little, only nodded at each new arrival like he was counting a flock back into a fold. Brom lay in the middle of all of it, by Faye's chair, and let the strangers step over him, and watched the door. And when Mrs. Farr Pearson reached down with a trembling hand to touch his head. He turned and pressed his nose once into her palm. Gentle, and the old woman's eyes filled and she had to look away. There was hardly room to stand. Wade carried in 2 folding chairs from his truck, and Faye apologized for not having more, and Okafor told her, dry, that she had never tried a case this strong out of a kitchen, the size of a coat closet, and she rather liked it. For a moment the cold, bare apartment was warm with bodies and coffee, steam and the low murmur of people who had each thought they were alone, discovering, one by one, that they were not. Faye sat in the middle of it, with the cannula at her lip, the tank breathing its low, even hiss beside her, and Wade saw the schoolteacher come back into her face, the one who had run a room full of children for 40 years. Okafor laid it out plain. The rent increase violated the notice period in the lease. The demand that Faye sign a liability waiver was not something any landlord could lawfully require. The eviction notice itself cited a fire hazard finding, and a fire hazard finding required a document. And that document either existed or it did not. If it existed and was real, they had a fight. If it existed and was forged, the company had a felony. They have a report, Faye said. They keep saying it, then they'll have to produce it, Okafor said. And the deputy fire marshal you called is going to read it. People who manufacture a paper trail usually count on no one ever cross-checking it against the real office whose name they borrowed. We are going to cross-check it, Mr. Vasquez opened his notebook and slid it across the table, and Wade read it aloud for the room because the old man could not hear the questions anyway. 3 years of dated entries, every letter received, copied, longhand. Every time the manager, Pruitt, had let himself into a unit without proper notice, the day a man with a clipboard measured the corner units. The day a glossy brochure had appeared under doors, advertising the Pemberton Mill lofts, weekly and nightly rentals, river views, starting rates that were triple what the old tenants paid. The plan was not hidden. It was just spread across 6 lonely apartments where no one had ever laid the pages side by side. The next morning, the manager came. Garrett Pruitt was a man in his early 50s, lean in a clean charcoal overcoat and good leather gloves, with combed-back graying hair and a smile he wore like a tool. He came up the stairs expecting one frightened old woman and found her door open and people inside, and his smile did not falter, which told Wade everything about how many times the man had done this before. "Holloway," Pruitt said warmly, ignoring everyone else. "I see you've got company. That's nice. I just need a moment to go over the timeline so there's no confusion about the move-out date." "There's confusion," Okafor said, not standing. "Mostly mine. I'm Miss Holloway's attorney. I'd like to see the fire hazard report your company cited in its notice. The one finding her oxygen equipment unsafe." For half a second, the smile thinned. Then it came back wider. "I'd have to pull that from the file." "These things take time." "They don't, actually," Okafor said. "It's a single document. You cited it 3 letters ago. If your company made a safety finding serious enough to evict a tenant on oxygen, you have it on hand. Producing it should take you the length of a phone call." Pruitt's gloved hands settled at his sides. Brahm, who had not moved, raised his head from the floor and looked at the man, ears forward, and did not look away. The dog made no sound. The silence the dog made was louder than a growl, and Pruitt felt it, and Wade watched him feel it. "I think," Pruitt said smoothly, "this is getting more complicated than it needs to be. The company is prepared to be generous. We can offer M.S. Holloway a relocation payment. $3,000. and we forget the back rent the increase generated, and everybody walks away. Friends, there's no back rent, Okafor said. The increase was unlawful, and we're not here to negotiate a payout. We're here to see a document. Produce the fire report, Mr. Pruitt, or withdraw the notice. He did neither that day. He said he would be in touch, and he left, and his footsteps on the stairs were faster than his smile had wanted them to be. Wade had learned long ago that the dangerous enemy is the one who retreats to prepare, and Pruitt had the foresight to fabricate a fire hazard finding in the first place, which meant he had the foresight to protect it. A careful man would not simply hope, no one asked again. A careful man would go make the document real. That was exactly what he did. 4 days later, Okafor's office received, in response to a formal demand, a single sheet of paper, a fire safety inspection report. It bore the letterhead of the Cobb's Reach Fire Department. It found that the oxygen equipment in Fay Holloway's unit was improperly secured, that the tank was stored in violation of code, and that the unit posed an unacceptable fire risk to the building. It was dated the previous autumn. At the bottom, above a printed name, was a signature, H. Greer, Deputy Fire Marshal. Fay's hands shook when Okafor showed it to her over the card table. "But he told you," she said to Wade. "On the phone, he said he never wrote it." "He didn't," Wade said. He was already reaching for his phone. This was the company's active defense, and it was a good one. Because a forged document that names a real official is far more dangerous than a lie with no paper behind it. It would look real to a judge. It would look real to the sheriff who came to enforce the order. Fay alone would never have known how to challenge a sheet of paper with a fire marshal's name on it. She would have packed her recliner and her Bible and her green tank and left. That was the whole design. But Fay was not alone, and the document had made one fatal mistake. It had borrowed the name of a living man with a slow mountain voice who took his office personally. Greer drove out to the mill himself the next morning in his own truck, with the report Okafor had emailed him printed and folded in his breast pocket. He came up the stairs slow, a heavy-set man in a department windbreaker, and he stood in Fay's doorway and looked at the green oxygen tank in its little cart, secured exactly as he had left it 2 years before, the medical card still hanging on the door. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to inspect this equipment one more time, with witnesses, and I'm going to put what I find in writing today with my real signature and the date and time. So there is never any question." He crouched by the tank, checked the regulator, the chain that held it upright, the clearance, everything. He stood up. Same as it was, secure, compliant, safe. There is no hazard here, and there never was. Then he took the forged report out of his pocket and laid it flat on a card table beside his own fresh one, and the room looked at the two signatures side by side. Greer's real signature was a slow, careful hand. The forgery was a hurried imitation, close but wrong, the kind a person makes when they have seen a signature once on a document and copied it from memory. The date on the forgery placed the inspection on a day Greer had a written record of being out of state at a training conference, 200 miles away, with 60 other fire officials to vouch for it. "They didn't just lie about the equipment," Greer said quietly. "They forged a state fire official's signature on a public safety document. That's not a housing dispute. I've already called it in to the state fire marshal's office and the county. There's an investigator coming." Wade watched Fay take this in. She did not look triumphant. She looked tired, and then she looked at the green tank that had held the threat, and her chin came up. "40 years I taught children to tell the truth," she said. "I'd about forgotten anyone over the age of 9 still cared whether you did." The thing did not end clean. the way things never do. Caldwell Asset Partners did what wealthy, careful companies do when the floor opens under them. They denied. They claimed the report had come from a contractor they had since terminated, a man they could not now locate, who had acted without authorization. They produced a new lawyer, polished and unbothered, who spoke of misunderstandings. Pruitt himself stopped answering the door of the management office. But the Tenants Association that had died 2 years before was alive now, 6 households, strong, with Loretta Sims running it like a postal route, and Mr. Prorse. Vasquez's notebook turned out to be the most dangerous object in the county. 3 years of dated entries in a deaf old man's careful hand established a pattern no terminated contractor story could explain away, because the pattern reached back long before the forged report and pointed straight at a coordinated effort to clear the rent-controlled units for short-term rental conversion. The newspaper Wade had not quite worked up the nerve to call, ended up calling them, after the fire marshal's investigation became a matter of public record, and a young reporter sat at Faye's card table with the same coffee Loretta poured everyone, and listened to 6 old people who had each been told they were the only problem. The Black Week came near the end, when it looked for a while like it might all slide off into the soft, endless mud of corporate delay. The company's new lawyer filed motions, dates got pushed. One cold morning, Faye woke short of breath in a way that frightened her, and the ambulance came, and the medical card on her door did exactly what Greer had designed it to do, and the medics knew about the oxygen before they crossed the threshold. She spent 3 nights in the county hospital, small in the bed with the tube under her nose, and Wade sat in the hard chair by the window with Bram lying across his boots, the dog allowed up by a charge nurse who took one look at the pair of them and decided some rules were worth bending. Faye's sister drove up from the south and sat on the other side of the bed, and the 2 old women held hands, and Wade looked out the window at the gray town and felt the old urge to leave rise in him, the urge that said, "This is not yours. You have done your part." He did not go. He sat in the chair. When Faye woke in the night and found him there, she did not seem surprised. "You're still here," she said. "I'm still here. Your dog's drooling on my floor." "He does that." She almost smiled. Then she slept, and the tank hissed, and Wade stayed. She came home to the mill 4 days later, weaker but stubborn, and by then the ground had shifted under Caldwell Asset Partners for good. And the state fire marshal's investigation confirmed the forgery. The county opened a fraud inquiry into the company's pattern of notices. Faced with criminal exposure on the forged document and a documented 3-year scheme laid bare in Mr. Pryor, Vasquez's notebook, and on the front page of the county paper, the company did the thing such companies always do at the end. It chose to disappear rather than to face it. It quietly sold the Pemberton Mill to a regional nonprofit housing trust that Pastor Ortiz, of all people, had a cousin on the board of a trust that bought aging buildings precisely to keep the long-term tenants in them. The new owners froze the old rents, repaired the heat, and replaced every cracked window pane in the building, though Wade had already done Faye's. Pruitt was never put against a wall. He was named in the fraud filings. And then he was gone, the way the careful ones go, on to some other town and some other building full of quiet people who did not yet know, to lay their letters side by side. Wade made his peace with that. The point had never been to break a man. The point had been to keep an old woman in her home, and she was in it, by her own window, with the river running below. Okafor closed her banker's box and drove her battered station wagon back over the county line. But she left her card with all 6 households and made each of them promise to call her at the first strange letter, and Loretta promised for all of them. Greer's medical equipment card still hung on Faye's door. The Tenants Association met the first Monday of every month in the church basement, where Wade had once thawed a pipe, and they kept Mr. Vasquez's notebook in a fireproof box that Loretta had bought with association dues, because they understood now what such a record was worth. Wade stayed in Cobb's reach. He had stopped pretending he was passing through somewhere around the second phone call, though he never said so out loud. He took the back room over Sutter's hardware store and made it permanent, and Bram got his porch at last, a strip of cold concrete behind the store where the dog could lie in the thin spring sun and watch the street. Wade fixed furnaces and hung doors and ran wire, and on the first Monday of every month he sat in the church basement at the back, not saying much, while 6 old people who had nearly lost their homes ran their own small government with great seriousness. He went to see Faye most weeks. He would fix some small thing that did not really need fixing. A sticking drawer, a flickering light, and she would lay out the cards for solitaire and not quite invite him to stay, and then set out the second cup anyway. And Bram would put his head in her lap and let her rest her thin hand on his skull, while the green tank hissed its steady rhythm in the corner. On a warm evening near the end of spring, Wade finished sealing a screen in the new window the Housing Trust had put in, and he stood a moment in the doorway of the small apartment he had first come to about a draft. The eviction notice was long gone. The oxygen tank stood in its card by the recliner steel in ordinary, just a machine that helped an old woman breathe, no paper taped to it and none coming. Faye sat in her chair with the river light on her face and the deck of cards in her hands, and Bram lay stretched on the warm floor in a band of sun, and the old schoolteacher looked up at the Marine in the doorway, who had come north to be no one and had ended up belonging to a whole coal town instead. "You'll be back Monday," she said. It was not a question. He looked at the dog asleep in the light, and the old woman by her window, and the green tank breathing steady in the corner of a home that was hers and would stay hers, and for the first time in a long time he could not find anywhere in himself the urge to leave. "I'll be back Monday," he said. "Sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is the quiet thing." Wade Marsh did not raise his voice or his hand. He peeled a cruel piece of paper off a sick woman's lifeline, and he made 3 phone calls, and he stayed. If you take anything from this, let it be that the vulnerable around you are rarely as alone as they have been made to feel, and that the difference between a person losing everything and keeping it is sometimes only one neighbor who refuses to look away. Look in on the old ones near you. Lay your letters side by side, and may God keep you and your family safe, and give you the courage to make the calls that need making, and the grace to stay when staying is hard.